This is about the science of logic by Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Hegel was the greatest and the last philosophical system builder. He stood on the shoulders of giants of philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Spinoza, and Kant. And on his shoulders stood people of significant political stature of 19th and 20th centuries: Ludwig Feuerbach, Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, Jean-Paul Sartre, and many others. To be more specific, this presentation is about the Doctrine of Essence, which is the second part of the science of logic. Essence is not only the essence of being, but in my opinion, it is also the engine, the locomotive of Hegel's science of logic itself. According to Hegel himself, Doctrine of Essence is the most difficult part of his book to understand. Hegel is a highly abstract thinker, and he has an obscure philosophical language of his own and a complex system of abstractions, relationships, and dialectical movements, which in their totality make up the system of logic. Thank you. As a student of Hegel, I would like to talk about the science of logic, the Doctrine of Essence. Hegel's logic appears in two books. First, in Science of Logic, or the Greater Logic, published in 1812, and later in Encyclopedia Logic, or the Shorter or the Lesser Logic, appeared in 1817. For the Greater Logic, there are two important or famous translations, one by A.V. Miller, published in 1991, and the latest translation is by Cambridge University, appeared in 2015. For Encyclopedia Logic, there are more than one translations, and I have put over here the most recent and the most important translation for Encyclopedia Logic. Science of Logic is divided in three doctrines: the Doctrine of Being, the Doctrine of Essence, and the Doctrine of Concept. The Doctrine of Concept will be really the unity of Doctrine of Being and Doctrine of Essence. Each of these doctrines are divided in their turn into three parts. The Doctrine of Being is divided into quality, quantity, and measure. And the Doctrine of Essence is divided into essence as its first moment, and appearance as its second moment, and actuality as its third or unifying moment. The Doctrine of Concept has subjectivity, objectivity, and idea. The whole Hegel's logic is a movement. And this movement is a movement towards the concept, towards the end, which is the concept. But at the same time, this movement, which has three moments, each of these moments will be really a concept as well. So the Doctrine of Being is doctrine of thought in its immediacy, or the concept in itself. The Doctrine of Essence is doctrine of thought in its reflection and mediation, and hence it's the being for itself and shine of concept. The Doctrine of Concept is doctrine of thought in its being returned into itself and its developed being with itself, or the concept in and for itself. in this presentation, in this episode, I will not put any emphasis on doctrine of being and neither on doctrine of concept. My main goal is about the doctrine of essence, and to be more exact, it's going to be about the first part of the doctrine of essence, which is essence or simple essence. And in this presentation, when we talk about essence, we really talk about the first moment of the doctrine of essence, which is essence itself. Doctrine of essence. Essence is a movement consisting of three distinct moments. The first moment is called simple essence, and the second moment is called the appearance, and the third one, which is the unity of the first and the second one, is called actuality. And in this presentation, we will be focusing on the simple essence. And at the same time, whenever we talk about essence, for this episode, we are talking about the simple essence. So knowing has for its goal, basically philosophy has for its goal, knowing of the truth. Things are not truly what they immediately show themselves to be. Things in their immediate being have no truth. The task or the purpose of philosophy is that it consists in the cognition of the essence of the things. Or to put it in other words, the task of philosophy is to bring about or bring out the ideality of the finite, the ideality of the finitude. So an immediate being has two views or two states to it. The state of the immediate, and the other state will be the state of in itself or the state of the essence of it. And what is false. According to Hegel, the immediate is false. The truth of the immediate is in the essence of the immediate. And this essence is the potentiality, is the ideality, is the purpose of the immediate. So the finitude of things consists in the fact that their immediate way of being does not correspond with what they are in themselves. Behind this immediate being, there is something else. The truth of the immediate being is in its potentiality of becoming, which constitutes its essence. So therefore, what we have here is the immediate, and what we have there on the other side is the essence, and there is no correspondence between these two. And because of that, one is the false, and the other one, which is the mediation of the immediate, is the truth. Now, the movement of essence at the very highest level is composed of three stages. The stage of abstract, the stage of negative, and the stage of concrete. Hegel talks about these three, as opposed to what is popularly known, and contrary to the spirit of Hegel, the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So the three levels, the three highest levels are not thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. It is abstract, negative, and concrete. To be more exact, the abstract maps to universal. And universal is the level of abstraction. It's the highest level of abstraction. And the negative maps to the particular, and the concrete, which in this case will be the concrete universal, is the unity of universal and singular. And singular is the same as individual. Now, it's important that we make a note of what I call 4+1 horses of Hegel's logic. It's important to know them. One is being in itself. And being in itself, it has within itself the absolute negativity, which is really the being for itself. The next one is being for another. And the next one is being in and for itself. And the final one is returning back to itself. So these 5 concepts constitute, and in the way that they're configured, constitute how logic moves along its dynamics. Hegel uses levels of cognition for a subject. And it's good to be familiarized with them before we get into the discussion of essence and the dialectics of essence. One is consciousness, and the other one is self-consciousness. Above that is reason, and the ultimate one is the absolute knowing. Consciousness at the lowest level is self-certainty, the sensation. And one level higher than that is perception. And the highest level of consciousness, he calls it understanding. And understanding is a level of abstraction making. It's a level that the process of analysis takes place. Self-consciousness is a transitional period in a sense, and it's a consciousness that is aware of itself, or it's a consciousness that is reflected through another and back to consciousness itself. Above this self-consciousness, you have reason. And reason has 2 stages to it. One is dialectical or negative reason, and one is a speculative or positive reason. And finally, the absolute knowing, which is the freedom and reason. It's a stage that a spirit knowing itself as a spirit. Another thing to be cognizant about is the variations of causes, because causes, they get used in Hegel's logic. Aristotle divided causes in 4: material cause, formal cause, efficient cause, and final cause. And in the case of a table, as an example, the material cause will be the wood that is used there, and the formal cause is the design. The efficient cause is the work of the carpenter, and the final cause is the purpose. In this case will be the dining. The 2 causes that get used in Hegelian's logic are efficient cause and final cause. And I brought this Aristotelian 4 causes definition so you get prepared for that discussion. Now, the capabilities of man are as follows. You have intelligence, which has abstract thinking, reflection, and you have the intelligence, which is the author of the purpose. You have the character, which has the willpower, and higher than that will be the will to destiny. the moral power will be the goodness, and the three human facilities will be the thinking, feeling, and activity. And levels of abstraction will be the universal, particular, and singular or individual. What manages all of these? What rules all of these? What is the director of all these human capabilities in bringing about change in history will be the human spirit, which Hegel calls it the Geist. And the Geist is the spirit of the self-conscious life, or the spirit is the self-consciousness of freedom. Now let's start with the Doctrine of Essence, but before that, let's go one level before, the Doctrine of Being. In Doctrine of Being, Hegel talks about being and not being. And in this doctrine, we are dealing with the consciousness, with the cognition being the consciousness. And the unity of the being and not being or nothing will be the becoming. In the discussion of the Doctrine of Being, being is every kind of being. It's a stone, is tree, and is man, and is everything. And the level of consciousness there will be the consciousness itself, which was the self-certainty, perception, and understanding. When we transition to Doctrine of Essence, we are dealing not with consciousness, but with self-consciousness, or we are primarily dealing with self-consciousness. How transition takes place? Here is how it takes place. We have being and we have not being. The not being of the being is really the potentialities of the being that at the moment does not exist, and it's a non-being of the being. When we transition to essence, we are in the realm of non-being of the being, and in this case, the non-being of the being is the potentiality, ideality, the destiny of being. If we are going to look at it at the general level, we have Doctrine of Being transitioning to Doctrine of Essence and culminating in Doctrine of Concept. The transition that I mentioned from the being to the essence was the non-being of the being, and in this case, non-being of the being is interpreted as the potentiality of the being that is not realized at the moment. And then in the realm of essence and concept, an internal, immanent, dialectical movement takes place, and then this non-being of the being will become being in its truth or the actuality of the potentiality. So we start from immediacy, going to potentiality, the dialectical movement, and actuality. The determinations of essence as a introductory thing, I will go in detail about them, are identity, difference, ground, and existence. And ground is the unity of identity and difference. Now, how in essence things get mapped into the previous doctrine, which is Doctrine of Being. So in essence, ground is similar to becoming in Doctrine of Being. Existence is being. So these two map into the ground and existence, they map into the becoming and being of Doctrine of Being. Now, the progression of the determinations of essence, which we mentioned, they are identity, difference, ground, and existence. I am showing them here in a linear sense. So we start from immediate being, and then we transition to essence of it, and then in essence we have identity, then difference, then ground, and finally existence. But this movement is not linear. This movement is circular. So you start from immediate being into identity, identity in a circular sense into the difference, and difference go to the ground, and ground returns back to identity, which becomes existence. So let's start the process. The subject looks at the immediate being through its self-certainty, through its sensation. What he sees is an immediate, in this case, May 68 France, which is here and now. This is the immediate knowledge. One level higher, you get to the perception. In the perception, you look at this immediate being and you want to know that, well, this is, but also it has properties. So you try to understand the properties of the immediate being. And the properties of immediate being, for example, in this case, will be the slogans and demands of this movement, the level of leadership of the movement, the level of organization of the movement, and the level of consciousness of freedom of the movement. And of course, many other properties of the immediate being. Then we go to a higher level. And the higher level is the level of understanding. And if you remember, the level of understanding is the highest level of consciousness. Here we are going to basically do the level of abstraction and to find out that what is the essence, what is underneath of this being, or what is the truth of this immediate being. From there, we get the essence. And the essence, it gives us the determination of identity. And this identity is really the essential quality of this immediate being. An immediate being has an essential quality and it has a bunch of properties. And here the identity maps with the essential quality of the immediate being. So what is identity? Which is one of the determinations of essence. It is also called being in itself, and it happens through reflection into itself. So basically, mind thinks over this immediate to find out what is the true meaning of it, what are the true potentialities of that. So this is through the power of reflection, and in this case, the reflection into itself of the immediate being. From there, we get the identity of this reality. This is really the abstract, and it is the abstract universal. In this presentation, I use this symbol, which is a triangle and a line, and this means it's a kind of. So identity is a kind of being in itself. Being in itself is the essence, is a kind of essence, and essence is a kind of abstraction,
and abstraction in this case is a universal. So we have the reality, and the first determination of essence is its identity. Now, identity has two features to it. From one point of view, it's a simple equality with itself. It's the A equal to A thing. But at the same time, it incorporates the absolute negativity or the negative of itself, which is represented by the being for itself within the being in itself of identity. The second moment of essence is called difference. So difference is one of the determinations, or the second determination of essence. Everything is something essentially distinct. Difference is a reflected difference, and difference is determined as the negativity that reflection possesses in itself. Difference is a distinction, and here is how it moves. So from identity, which itself was reflection into itself, we reflect through the identity into another, or reflection into another, and that gives us the difference or the distinction. So you have now itself and you have its other. This its other, contrary to what people think, is not something really opposite, meaning totally different. It is the other dimension of itself, which here constitutes its other. I will discuss it later. So this difference will be also called reflection into another, or being for another. And it maps into the negative or particular. So we started from abstract, we went into negative. We started from universal, we went into particular. We started from being in itself, we went to being for another. We started from reflection into itself, we went into reflection into another. We started from identity, we went to difference. So, how reflection into another works? This part of presentation you have probably never have seen anywhere, and it's the first time that I am exposing it. So how does it work? Identity maps into the essential quality of the immediate being. Difference is a collection of properties. Let's read how Hegel says it. Difference is the deficiency, the limitation, the shortcoming, the restrictedness, or the one-sidedness of the object in realizing its own identity, which is its own ideality. Identity is the essential quality of the object. Difference has a collection of properties. An identity of object, through its essential quality, shines into the relevant properties of the difference of the same object. And this is how the reflection into another takes place. In other words, here is how it goes. Through this quality, we reflect into important, relevant properties of the object to see if these properties of the object are really enhancing or restricting, limiting or enabling the realization of the quality of the object. And the quality, keep in mind, that is the potentiality. Is this property number one helping the potentiality, i.e. the essential quality of the object to be realized, is the property number 2, helping the realization of the identity, the realization of the quality to take place, or are they limitations? So the quality reflects into the properties of the same object to see how its realization can take place, and usually, because the immediate is false, all of these properties are deficient. Since these properties are deficient, these properties are the difference. These properties are the distinction as opposed and in front of identity. So, how the difference is going to evolve itself? The difference, which has properties, and we mentioned the identity has quality, the difference will be turning into a diversity of different differences. Basically, based on the properties of the object, you can have different variations of the object created, and that gives a diversity. The diversity will be emerged into opposition, and opposition will be the positive or the negative, which really will be the ideality in front of the and opposed to the reality, or the quality in front of and opposed to the property. So this is what really opposition in Hegelian logic means. So this opposition will be a contradiction. And this contradiction is the moving spirit of change. From this contradiction, we get this. Let's read Hegel again. Difference as contradiction. Identity is only the determination of simple immediacy, of inert being, whereas contradiction is the root of all movement and life. It is only insofar as something has a contradiction within it that it moves, is possessed of instinct and activity. Contradiction is rather the negative in its essential determination, the principle of all self-movement, which consists in nothing else than in the display of contradiction. Something is alive, therefore, only to the extent that it contains contradiction within itself. Indeed, force is this, to hold and endure contradiction within. Or contradiction is the root of all movement of life, and we mentioned that. The proximate result of the opposition posited as contradiction is the ground, which contains within itself both identity and distinction as sublated and reduced to merely ideal moments. So we get from contradiction, which is the ultimate moment of difference, we get to the ground. So everything has a sufficient ground or reason. So here ground basically means reason. Nothing should be considered to exist as an immediate, but rather should be considered as a posited. Ground is the unity between identity and difference. Ground is the living unity of identity and difference, and ground is the final ground or causa finalis. And let's look at that through more statements from Hegel. Ground does not yet have any content that is determinate in and for itself, nor is it purpose. So it is neither active nor productive. Instead, an existence simply emerges from the ground. To be a true final cause, it must be just and good. It needs to be universal. So let's see what happens. We started from identity. We went into difference. Difference through the stages of diversity, opposition, contradiction. It came and became resolved in ground. So ground is the third determination of essence, and is the final cause or the final reason or the sufficient reason. Not the sufficient reason of what is, but sufficient reason for realizing what is. To recap on that, we started from abstract, which was universal, which was being in itself, which was identity. We moved into the negative, which was particular, which was being for another, which was difference, and then we transitioned into ground, which is the final cause of the movement. And this final cause is the being in and for itself. It's a singular. It's a singular. In order for this cause to be active and to be productive, here is what happens. For a ground, i.e. for this purpose to be active and productive, it needs to become a motive that produces something. For instance, by being taken up by someone's will, which first makes it active and the cause. So, the contradiction, which was the purpose, it has to be fused with the will of an individual. And the will of an individual, in this case, will be the ground for the change. And then it's going to bring about the activity. And to be more exact, the purposive activity. Hegel calls the reason as purposive activity. So the general view of the ground, we started from identity, from the potentiality. We transitioned to difference, i.e. we started from reflection into itself of the immediate. We found the identity. We reflected into the another of the object itself. We found a difference. And then we found out that the identity and difference are in contradiction. And then this contradiction, which starts or which goes from opposition to contradiction, is really a tension between identity and difference. And the difference here, we said, it's a limitation, it's a deficiency, it's a one-sidedness of the object itself that prevents the object to realize its potentiality. These two have to be united, these two determinations. And these two determinations, when they get united, the unity of them is the essential unity. And essential unity usually brings about a different determination. And in this case, the different determination was the purpose, i.e. the ground, i.e. the final cause. And the final cause for what? The final cause for the realization of the potentiality of the immediate object to reach its goal, to reach its ideality. In order to do that, this purpose had to be fused with the will of the man, and most probably with the will of an individual man. And this will should turn into the will to destiny. And then action should take place. What kind of action? Action that is defined as reason, because reason is nothing but purposive activity and is composed of dialectical negative reason, dialectical negative activity, and a speculative positive reason, i.e. a speculative positive purposive activity. They culminate into an operation which is called sublation, in German Aufhebung, and it is made of three components: to negate or to annul the limitations of the object, to preserve or conserve the good qualities of the object, and then to transcend the object to a totally higher level. And the transcendence or promotion of the object to the highest level takes place through a speculative thinking, through a speculative purposive reason. Ground and world historic individuals. So we said that the ground is purpose. Purpose should fuse with the will. And in history, you see that Hegel talks about several world historic individuals which they brought about change in history. One was Napoleon Bonaparte and one was Caesar of Roman Empire. So that shows the dynamism of this dialectical movement, that it's not deterministic. It is the result of the will of the man to change the existing situation to a higher level. The fourth moment of essence is existence, which is the result of the activity of the ground. So ground is the self-sublating, and what it sublates itself toward the result of its negation is essence, is existence. And existence is returning of the object to itself. It's a return back to itself. So here is what we have. We started again from identity, we went into difference, we came into the ground, which was the cause, and the cause is the being in and for itself, i.e. the self-consciousness of the subject to bring about change, and then the change takes place through the effect, and the effect is existence. So if we want to show the fourth moment, the existence, in its complete picture, here it is. Again, we started from identity, which was being in itself, which was abstract, i.e. universal. We reflected into another, which was the difference. which was the being for another, which was the negative, which was the particular. So the universal became particularized, and then from there the unity of these two brought about the ground, and the ground is being in and for itself. Keep in mind that identity was the result of consciousness, and the consciousness was really being in itself. But here we are dealing with being in and for itself. This is self-consciousness. Self-consciousness of a singular or an individual that brings about existence, which is returning back to itself, which is concrete, which is universal. And the loop completes. So, to sum up, the dialectics of the essence is as follows. You can look at it from this state machine, that you start from being in itself, which is reflection into itself, and then you reflect into another, which is being for another, and then going to the being in and for itself, and then returning back to itself. If you know this, if you learn this, you will be able to understand Hegel's text easier. Not easiest, but easier. And this is the state machine of Hegel's logic, starting from being in itself to being for another, to being in and for itself, and then returning back to itself. And this is a loop. To show it in a different form, this state machine, which is the mother of Hegelian logic, it's in a circular sense. I'm showing it here. Again, it's the same thing, being in itself, being for another, being in and for itself, and returning back to itself. To show it in the form of consciousness, we started from consciousness, which was understanding. We went into self-consciousness, then dialectical negative reason, then a speculative negative reason, and then the object returned back to itself. Now, this dialectical movement of essence in terms of the four determinations, which we talked about them, are as follows. Identity, difference, ground, existence. In terms of the syllogism, because Hegelian dialectics, in essence, is a syllogism. So, a syllogism is a movement of three judgments, is made of three judgments, and a judgment is subject and predicate. So, a syllogism has three judgments in it. The major premise, which shows that particular is universal. The minor premise is singular is particular. And the conclusion statement or judgment is that singular is universal. Now let's see how that maps into the Hegel's dialectic. Identity was universal. So from universal to particular, which was particular is universal. This was the first major premise. And then from there we went to minor premise, which was singular is particular, which is right over here, from difference to ground. And then from ground to existence, we deal with the conclusion or the judgment, that is the conclusion judgment, and in that we have singular is universal. So basically, Hegel's logic of movement in essence, which is dialectical, is a logical syllogism. Now here I'm showing the whole thing again, so you see the whole hierarchy, from abstract to negative to singular to concrete or concrete universal, from being in itself, with being for itself, into being for another, going to being in and for itself, and then returning back to itself. And then we had from the identity to difference to ground and to existence. And then we showed that we went from reflection into itself to reflection into another, and then ground was the consciousness of freedom plus will to destiny that brings about existence. Now, in terms of the fact that Hegel's dialectic or dialectical movement of essence is the unity of analysis and synthesis. So from immediate to identity is the analysis, from difference all the way to existence is synthesis. From the immediate, you go through the reflection, to speak in Kantian sense, which is going from the concrete to abstract, and then from abstract, which is the universal, you go to level of concretization, i.e. you go to particular, you go to individual, and then basically you finish the process of synthesis. So dialectical movement of essence is the unity of analysis and synthesis. This is the whole thing again. So we had the immediate, we went to identity and difference, that gives us the opposition. Opposition became contradiction. Contradiction became essential unity. Essential unity became purpose. Purpose is the ground. Ground is fused with the will of individual, and it brings about the reason. Reason was purposive activity. Purposive activity brings about sublation. Sublation is the negation, preservation, and elevation, and then you come to the existence, which is the sublated unity of subject-object. Hegel calls this, or shows this in this phrase: substance is subject. Now, when that iteration finished, you get into the next iteration, and then the next iteration, and then the next iteration in a circular sense. And I am showing it over here, the circular loops that go up, and the final goal is to reach to absolute idea. So Hegel's dialectics is not only circular, but is a spiral, and the final goal of that is absolute idea. Now, appearance is the second part of the doctrine of essence. According to Hegel, essence must appear. So here we have essence, we have appearance, and we have the unity of both, which is actuality. And appearance will be covered in a future episode. Let's take the case of a social practice and see how Hegel's essence or dialectics of the essence work. We have May 68, France, and the object is this one. And we have a subject. The subject looks at the object through his understanding, through his power of abstraction. And he asks, what is the essence of this object, this immediate? And the essence of the immediate is the potentiality. And because the potentiality is not realized, the immediate in itself, or the immediate as such, is false. The truth of it is in its ideality, in the essence. And this essence is denoted by an essential quality. So this object has essential quality that represents the ideality of it. So in this case, freedom is the ideality. The purpose of this movement is freedom. So freedom or liberation, which is the quality or the essential quality of this, will represent the ideality of it. So we call it identity. So from there, we go to identity. How we went into identity? We reflected into itself. So the process of reflection into itself, which means thinking over of this immediate, we get to identity. So identity is reflection into itself. Reflection into itself. And this is something universal. Freedom is freedom. Freedom is something universal. Liberation is something universal. So this is abstract. It's an abstract concept. And this identity is really the self-reference. Now, according to Hegel, this identity, although it's a self-reference, but in it, it has absolute negativity. And absolute negativity, he calls it the power of being for itself. The power of being for itself to generate a new itself. So A will become the new A, not become the same A. So A becomes the new A is the being for itself of the self-reflection, of the self-reference of identity. So we got that. So how did we get this? This was understanding. Or this is consciousness. So what is consciousness and why it's different from self-consciousness? Every time that man looks at the object outside of himself and separate himself from the object and wants to look at the object separate from itself, he is using his consciousness. His consciousness is separate from the object. Now from here, this is freedom. We reflect into another level of reflection. Reflection into another. So this is itself. The itself is the identity. Now, what is the other? The other is the same object itself. It's not a different object. It's the same object itself. But the same object itself, from the point of view of its restrictions and limitations and one-sidedness and deficiencies, which it imposes on the freedom for its realization. So the object, and then we get to difference or distinction, which is reflection into another. This is a form of negative. So we go from abstract to negative, or from universal to particular. So now this object, so difference is a representation of the collection of the properties of this. So we look at the important properties of this. Property 1, property 2, property 3, and so on and so forth. And we reflect the quality into the property. This is called reflection into itself. It's called reflection into another. So we say that, well, let's see, this has a level of leadership. Is this level of leadership sufficient for liberation? And if it's not, what are the extent of this limitation? Now, we have P2 is the level of organization of the movement. Is this level of organization of the movement in compliance with the goal of freedom? And we see that these will be limitations or the difference or the distinctions that are imposed on the identity. So this thesis, antithesis, all that nonsense has nothing to do with dialectics. So this is, they call this antithesis. What is antithesis? This is the same object and viewed from its properties. And we are reflecting the quality of the object into the properties of the object to see that if they match for the realization of the identity or the ideality. So from there we get contradiction. So contradiction is between who and who, between the positive and the negative. And the positive and the negative. And the positive is nothing but this guy, is identity itself. So freedom is identity, is the positive. And then let's say that the lack of leadership is the most important impediment, the most important deficiency of this movement. That is the negative. So the negative is the level of leadership. There will be a contradiction between the ideality, i.e. freedom, and the reality, which is the level of leadership. Now, this has to be resolved in a way, and the unity of this identity and this difference, or the resolution of these two, or the unity between these two, is nothing but the purpose. And purpose, more or less, is nothing but back to this guy, the identity. So this purpose, which is in Hegelian sense, is the ground, which is the sufficient cause, final cause. In order to be materialized and be productive, this purpose has to fuse with the will of a man. And what kind of will? That should be the will to destiny. Purpose fuses with the will of destiny of the leadership. A leadership who is damn serious, that wants to bring this realization, bring this liberation to actuality. This ground, which is self-consciousness. So now notice that consciousness from here, when it comes to there, is turned to self-consciousness, because the consciousness over here looked at this outside, said, I am what I am, and this is the May 68 France. Now it's saying that I'm part of it, and not only I'm part of it, I want to change it. So what happens is this: consciousness reflects into the object, and that reflects back into the consciousness itself. So self-consciousness is when the consciousness reflects into the object and comes back to itself, then becomes self-consciousness. So here the self-consciousness, which Hegel calls being in and for itself, this has to become reason. And what is the definition of reason? The reason for Hegel is not just logic and syllogism and all that, the judgment and syllogism and all that stuff, the logical discussion. For Hegel, reason is purposive activity, meaning an activity that realizes this purpose, which is this identity. And when it realizes it, it has to modify this object, the object of being. The object of being will go through the May 68 movement, will go through sublation. The deficiencies of that, which is the lack of leadership or the lack of proper leadership, will be negated. The mobilization and the militancy and the good stuff of that will be preserved. And then this movement will be changed to a higher level movement, to a movement for its own independent, self-determining sense of agency. And when that happens, the immediate went through identity to difference, to ground, became existence. And existence is being returning back to itself in a circular movement. In a circular movement. So what we are going to have is this. So we had here immediate, which was is. It went through the identity, and generally it went through the dialectics. And then it brought about exists, which was the existence. And exists is basically the reality, but in the mind, defined in the mind. And Hegel says something before it is, it is exists. So this exists will bring about another is. But this is one. This is two. And this is two is sublation of is one. And the ground, which was the fusion of the purpose with the will of destiny, which did the sublation, which did the reason, which was the dialectical negative reason and the speculative positive reason brought about existence, made the is one to exist and then to become is again, but at a higher level. And when this happens, you really have actuality, which is the third part of Hegel's logic. So therefore, Hegel says that truth is whole, and the whole is essence that consummates all its process. It consummates all its process. So through abstract, we went to negative, and then from negative, we went to concrete, which became the universal concrete. And the loop ends. And of course, this is not going to be the end of the thing. This process will be circular and will be a spiral till man reaches final freedom. So the method of essence is not a method of analyzing something as such. It's the method of change, is method of revolutionary change, and is the method of revolutionary change of social practice, of social existence. So the dialectics is not the dialectics of nature, is not the dialectics of the trees or dialectics of the stones, is the dialectics of the man, because it deals with consciousness and it deals with self-consciousness. Here is how Hegel defines his dialectic. Hegel describes it like this. With regard to its form, the logical has three sides. A, the side of abstraction or of the understanding. B, the dialectical or negative rational side. And C, the speculative or positively rational one. The three moments of everything logically real, i.e. of every concept or of everything true in general. And then here it says that true is the whole, but the whole is nothing other than essence consummating itself through its development. And this is very important, that essence or the whole is essence, and essence is nothing but consummating all its steps. So in other words, if you go back into this, the whole is this whole thing, this whole enchilada. This whole thing is essence, and essence has to go through identity, through difference, through ground, to get to the existence. So now, here's the question. Is Hegelian dialectics what some people call it thesis, antithesis, and synthesis? Some people think that Hegelian dialectics is the combination of these three things. First thing first, Hegel never used this terminology of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. You cannot find this formulation in Hegel's work. He did not state his dialectics in terms of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. In fact, this formulation comes from another philosopher, Fichte, a contemporary of Hegel, and Hegel used to ridicule this triad of Fichte in terms of something that defines the dialectics. Using thesis, antithesis, synthesis is the crudest way of representation of dialectics. And not only that, not only is it trivial, not only is it useless, not only is it empty, it's really something that renders dialectics absolutely useless, absolutely inactive, and absolutely non-productive. So there are two dialectics, Hegel's dialectics and Marx's dialectics, which, according to himself, he modified Hegelian dialectics and he used it in his Capital. Hegel's dialectics is obviously in two books, logic, in two logic books, the greater logic and the shorter logic, and he used it in his phenomenology of spirit. Marx did not fully define what his dialectic is, but he used it in his Capital. And because this is an important concept, an important issue, and a confusing one, I will be covering this in the next episode. Thank you.